Good afternoon and welcome to today's event, Australia and Korea Middle Powers in Uncharted Waters. I am Yvonne Kim, Executive Director of Asia Society Korea. It is my great pleasure to join my colleagues at Asia Society Australia today, as it is the first of a larger three-part project seeking to provide new understanding to the unique position of Australia and Korea in regional geopolitics and how it intersects with their respective trade and economic status. We would like to thank the Australia-Korea Foundation in the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for supporting today's program. Please follow the link we're sharing with you now to find more about this exciting project. And before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. As many of you are aware, this year marks the 60th anniversary of the establishment of the diplomatic ties between Australia and the Republic of Korea. And these two countries have been playing a major role in shaping the economic and security landscape of the Indo-Pacific. Although the bilateral relationship between Korea and Australia was elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership earlier this year, this strategic relationship now faces some unique constraints and challenges as the Asia-Pacific enters a dangerous period of rivalry and tension. It is no secret that the US-China relationship has entered an unstable territory, as Asia Society's own in-house expert Danny Russell at the Policy Institute points out. For China, 2021 has been a high testosterone year of nationalist anniversaries and chest-bumping assertiveness on its neighbors. And for the United States, it has been a year of struggle and recovery in which the China challenge has been a major animating force. Also, our Policy Institute's Wendy Cutler states that China's increasing role in setting rules and standards in a way that could undermine the attainment of a level playing field for all participants in the regional economy. And these are perilous levels of distrust between US and Chinese militaries in the Indo-Pacific region. As middle powers, what role can Australia and Korea play going forward in promoting an open, inclusive, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region? And how can we rebalance our relationships? Before we begin answering those questions, let me go through the usual housekeeping. Our project fellow, Wongi Choe, will start by presenting his recent policy memo. We'll then unpack his findings in a 35-minute panel discussion. And we'll end with a Q&A session, so please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A box at any time. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. As mentioned, Wongi Choe is our Asia Society Australia Korea Fellow, where he's been doing policy research on Korea's role in the geopolitical dynamics and regional architecture in East Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific region. Currently, he serves as professor at Korea National Diplomatic Academy and as a member of advisory group at the Presidential Committee on New Southern Policy in Korea. Hayley Channer is a senior policy fellow at the Perth USAsia Centre, where she produces analysis on Australia's foreign and defense policy in the Indo-Pacific. Hayley has led a diverse career across government, think tanks, and the not-for-profit sector. She previously worked for the Department of Defense, producing policy advice on Australia's defense cooperation with the United States and Japan. Jeffrey Robertson is an associate professor at Yonsei University and a visiting fellow at the University of Melbourne's Asia Institute. Before moving to academia, he worked for the Australian government in the field of foreign policy in North Asia, focusing on China, the Korean Peninsula, and Japan. Welcome everyone, and thanks again for participating in our panel. It's great to have you with us, and I'm really looking forward to today's session. So Wongi, are you ready to share your policy memo?
All right, thank you, Yvonne. Thank you very much. So I'm very glad to have a chance to speak today, and I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to this webinar. Well, as I wrote in my policy memo, which was published yesterday on the website of Asia Society Australia, Korea and Australia are natural partners to each other, given we have multiple ties in terms of fundamental values we share, our extensive mutual economic interests and a lot of new opportunities ahead of us. And also, we share strategic interests as well as concerns and challenges. We both face the same kind of geopolitical kind of challenges. So I think it is very good news that the two leaders of our country, President Moon and Prime Minister Morrison, last June agreed to elevate our bilateral relations to a comprehensive strategic partnership, which is the highest level of partnership between any two countries. So I think the task ahead of us is how to realize the potentials we have in various areas, in economic areas, diplomatic areas, as well as just strategic areas, and also how to deal with the common challenges we face. So I think, for example, as open trading nations, both Korea and Australia face growing pressures to mitigate the geoeconomic risks and challenges associated with our dependence on foreign trade. In case of Korea, more than 70% of our overall GDP comes from international trade. So we are vulnerable, very vulnerable to exogenous shocks from outside. So we have the bitter experiences like Australian fellows did. For example, the heavy, economic reliance we have on China provided kind of a source of our the political vulnerability, and we suffered a lot from Chinese targeted measures of economic coercion couple of years ago, and I know that Australians also had a similar experience. And also, as treaty allies of the United States, we both have invested interest in keeping the strategic stability of the international rules-based order. I think we share the same concern of the stability of the Indo-Pacific region in light of the increasingly assertive China and the U.S. declining relative military position in the region. Also, as a open trading nation, we have concerns about the potential disruptions to trade and energy supply routes and the erosion of international maritime laws and norms. So we have enormous a lot of common challenges and interest. So I think we have a lot of reasons to work together. So the question ahead of us is how we can organize a higher level of collaboration and coordination in order to deal with these challenges, and also to realize the potentials we have. So I think these are some of the questions that we can discuss today, and I'll stop here and look forward a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Wongi. We'll give you some time to catch your breath, and we'll come back to you later with questions. In the meantime, before we get too deep into how the worsening of the US-China relationship is impacting all of us, Jeff, what does it exactly mean to be a middle power in the region? I mean, where do Australia and Korea's interest in this region align, and where do they diverge?
Okay, so being a middle power, generally speaking, there's shared interests in that all middle powers share the interest in constraining the power of those above them and imposing order on those below them. So both Australia and Korea have sought to do this in their own ways, which reflect their historical interaction with the outside community. So Australia sought to impose international norms, codes of behavior, rules of law. South Korea sought to balance and counterbalance. But at heart, these are fundamentally different conceptualizations of what it means to be a middle power. and ultimately they imply divergent middle power approaches. So I was at a conference around about 10 years ago in Seoul on middle powers. And the first speaker got up there and said, South Korea is a middle power because it's between developing and developed states. The second speaker got up there and said, South Korea is a middle power because it's between East and West. And the third speaker got up there and said, South Korea is a middle power because it's between China and the US. There was an Australian diplomat sitting to the left of me. And by the third speaker, they were looking pretty nervous. So here's a fundamentally divergent approach to what it actually means to be a middle power. That was 10 years ago. Today, being a middle power is not so significant. It really doesn't mean much. So we're entering a period of instability, as you've mentioned. And when you're entering a period of instability, a lot of the traditional middle power tools no longer work. They start to transform. So characteristic middle power behavior like activist diplomacy turns into alliance engagement. Niche diplomacy turns into the demonstration of niche relevance to alliance partners. Coalition building becomes alliance building. Good international citizenship becomes multilateral enforcement. The middle power era, as we've known it, has pretty much ended. But middle powers, it's still a useful theme to establish solidarity and similarity, albeit hollow, between states such as Korea and Australia, where neglect and underinvestment has pretty much left the relationship somewhat wanting. It allows them to keep talking and interacting as we're doing today. But for all intents and purposes, being a middle power is today largely irrelevant. And Australia and Korea, they really need to look beyond the concept of middle power, the middle power mantra, and hopefully that's where the comprehensive strategic partnership will come in.
Okay, so in terms of looking beyond, well, Korean government has been trying to separate the economy and diplomacy as a balancing act, standing as an ally of the US on security matters while partnering with China for economic reasons. But its two-track diplomacy of separating its national security and economic interests has been raising some serious questions. And Washington's effort to develop a US-centric global supply chain and besiege Beijing economically leaves the Korean companies with tough choice. And these companies also have to be wary of a retaliation from China. And as Wongi just mentioned, not too long ago, US troops deployed a THAAD missile defense system in South Korea in a step aimed at North Korea, but which China insisted could snoop on its own systems. And in apparent retaliation, Chinese travel agents halted group tours to South Korea, while consumer boycotts damaged the Chinese operations. The automaker Hyundai and forced Lotte to close down retail operations, and they banned imports of Korean whey products, including K-pop. So Hayley, as Australia tries to diversify away from China, and what can Australia learn from Korea in managing its own China relationship? Is there any specific strategy being placed?
Thank you so much, Yvonne, and to the Asia Society for having me. It's a really important discussion that we're having today because I think a lot of countries that are overly reliant and dependent as export-led economies on one partner, and that partner being China, are needing to rethink their foreign policy, defense, and economic strategies in response. So as you mentioned, back a couple of years ago, South Korea faced a lot of difficulty in its relations with China after the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System decision. And so we're seeing in that relationship, China penalized South Korea for something that South Korea did in a defense sense. China used its economic might to be able to exert pressure on South Korea in a way that it wasn't able to exert pressure on the United States, for instance. And at the time, a lot of South Korean companies realized quite early that they needed to diversify. And that's exactly what Australia has been doing over the last couple of years. So my research director at the Perth USAsia Centre, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, has written a fantastic piece on this, which I will share in the chat, where Australia was subject to coercive economic measures from China, from everything from coal to beef to barley to lobsters. And definitely Australian companies are now looking to diversify. And in fact, when China did exert this economic pressure on Australia on a thing such as coal, when China received its coal from other markets like the Russian market or the Indonesian market, that actually meant that the other buyers of that coal, like South Korea, Japan, and India, were looking to Australia to fill that need. So in that instance, China's economic coercion of Australia didn't actually play out in a way that China had perhaps intended. And so I think both Australia and South Korea are muddling through this new period where economics is enmeshed in security and defense and diplomacy. And the business community is really leading the way in terms of showing how other measures can be adopted, other markets can be brought on board to kind of spread this risk. So I think there's a lot for Australia to learn from the South Korean example, and that lots of countries are moving in this direction. And hopefully it will even open up new trading opportunities between Australia and South Korea.
So Jeff, you can step in anytime, but Hayley, following up to what you just mentioned, is that the kind of advice you'd also give to the Korean people when they're trying to strategize their relationship with China?
In terms of the business community?
Yes.
Yes, I would think that, I mean, diversification is something that's going to happen over a number of years to spread the risk. And really, this is reaching into a territory where it's not my area of expertise on economics, but is definitely one that China is using to fulfill its strategic ambitions. And I think in some areas it will be successful and in others it will backfire. Although, having spoken with other China experts earlier today, I know that China is really focused on its domestic internal messaging. So even when it disrupts some of its trade relations and some of its diplomatic relations, this can have a net positive effect internally, whereby nationalism is really ramped up and the Chinese community sees the Chinese Communist Party as really allowing China to reach China's full potential, take China's place on the world stage next to the United States. And so it will be interesting, and Australia will need to continue working with South Korea over the next couple of years and decades, because even if China's strategy doesn't work externally, it can have internal net positive benefits. So that's not really changing China's behavior. So we're really going to have to think more creatively about how to bring China with us into a system of operating where all states' sovereignty is respected and states are really allowed to pursue their interests free of some of this economic coercion.
Yes, Jeff.
So I think we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here, though, because South Korea and Australia's trajectory in how they're dealing with China are so divergent and so different. It's neither is going to see the other as taking the correct approach. There's got to be a lot of bilateral work before that to get anywhere near understanding each other's approach. They are fundamentally different. South Korea is seeking to balance its interests with the United States and China. Australia has aligned itself with the United States. Not even aligned itself, as maybe even leading the United States. These are fundamentally different approaches. And until South Korea and Australia actually learn and understand each other and their points of view and how they're working and their trajectories, there's really going to be not a lot of cooperation which can proceed.
And Wongi, did you want to comment on that too?
Yes, yeah, well, yeah, as Jeffrey pointed out, I think both Australia and South Korea does face the so-called China dilemma, right? So China has been the #1 trading partner, and in case of Korea, not only in economic relationship, but in relate to the North Korean issue, China's influence over the Korean Peninsula is quite large. So we have to always factor that in mind. But I think even if we do have the same China dilemma or China question, I think the ways in which we frame the China question is quite different. In case of Australia, as Jeffrey pointed out, it's a matter of Chinese increasingly assertive behavior and disruptive behavior, disrupting the rules-based order, right? So it is a matter of standing firm against China and deterring China, working together with allies and partners, right? But in case of Korea, I mean, it's a little bit different. It's a matter, we Koreans typically frame the issue is that, in Korean the way of doing describing this is that we are being squeezed between two big whales, right? We are small shrimp being squeezed with whales, right? So the analogy is that it's like that. So Korea has fallen into a new geopolitical ditch of being caught in the crossfire between the two great powers. So the question is not how to stand against China. It's more of how we should manage the relationship with China as well as the United States. So in the meantime, be able to maintain a certain degree of autonomy. So even if we do have the same China challenge, I think the ways in which we frame the issue and prioritize our response is a little bit different. In that way, I think we Koreans have more things that we should learn from Australia than we can teach to Australians in that regard.
Okay, Wongi, then you as you pointed out exactly that Korea happens to be geographically closer to China, and that poses a bigger problem. And as you also pointed out, both Australia and Korea are concerned about disruptions to trade and energy supply routes. And on the other hand, Australia has been able to firmly secure its position with Quad and now AUKUS. And Korea traditionally wanted to stay in the middle, but found themselves stuck in the middle. So do you think that Australia and Korea can continue to stay as middle powers, or it's no longer viable?
I think Korean approach so far is taking a position of strategic ambiguity, right? So in areas where you do not have sensitive issues, then you take an approach of strategic clarity. But in such issue areas where you have very sensitive responses, either from the US or China, for example, in the issue of South China Sea and the maritime security issues, this is very sensitive. So the prevailing way of Koreans' approach to this issue is that this is a matter between the two great powers. So we should minimize the risk of entrapment between the power rivalry going on between the two big countries. So, well, this sort of approach worked in the past, but I think the rooms we can maneuver with this sort of approach of strategic ambiguity is getting smaller and smaller. So, yeah, so this poses a kind of challenge. So I think in that regard, I think there has been some sort of changes on the part of Korean government. For example, if you look at the outcome result of Korea-US summit last May in Washington between President Moon and President Biden, for the first time in this Moon administration, we have the highest level of document, the strongest word from Korean side, that we will work together with Americans with America's Indo-Pacific vision, and we are ready to expand the scope of Korea-US alliance beyond the Korean Peninsula. Korea is ready to take more regional roles, things like that. So I think in this way, the Korea's strategic perception is slowly evolving. So I think that's the result of either pressure or also a new opportunity. So in that regard, I think there are more rooms that Koreans and Australians can work together. And we have to discuss seriously about the strategic of considerations and sensitivities and things like that.
Okay. And Hayley, I'm going to go back to what you mentioned about coal. And China suffered shortage of coal since they banned imports of Australian coal in 2020 in retaliation for Australia's joining of the Quad. And it was largely seen as an anti-China grouping. And as a result, Korea is facing a new problem with something called urea because of China's decision to stop its exports and creating the shortage here, which is impacting everything from cargo deliveries to bus and emergency vehicle operations. And South Korea has been hit hard by semiconductor chip issue as well. And there aren't any new cars available right now. And logistics businesses are hurting really badly as a result. So in other words, the general public in Korea is greatly suffering because of the trade disputes between China and the US. And so Hayley, how is the Australian general public perceiving this US-China rivalry? I mean, is it impacting the Australian people directly like it is in Korea locally?
Well, firstly, I want to say, although I work for the Perth USAsia Centre, counterintuitively, I live in Canberra. I'm the Canberra point person for my centre. So I live in a bubble because Canberra is a small community and there's lots of foreign and defence policy wonks such as myself here. And so I have to reach out to my friends and family that live in places like Perth and Queensland to actually get a sense of what the Australian public opinion is. And I've also looked at things like the Lowy polls, and definitely the tensions between the United States and China, and also the related tensions between Australia and China because of things like the Quad, because of things like the AUKUS technology and submarine agreement, are raising tensions in our country. And this is having a trickle-down effect at the grassroots level. A couple of ways that I'm seeing that it has been the long-standing way, which is such a large percentage of Australia's trade is with China. In West Australia, 60% of West Australia's trade is with China. So the views that I hear over on the West Coast are totally different to the views I hear over on the East Coast, which is pretty fascinating for me. So a lot of politicians in West Australia think that the Australian federal government's approach to China and to US-China rivalries is too harsh. And in fact, we should be much more accommodating of China. And there's also some resentment because West Australia props up the Australian economy hugely because it's a mining state. So that's the business side of things. There's also a more personal side of things, which is in the very large community of Chinese Australians that are here in Australia. Actually, I saw a speech by the Shadow Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, yesterday, and she mentioned that almost 1/3 of Australians have been born overseas. So there is a hugely escalating number of Australians that have different experiences. The third largest country destination is China. So 2.5% of Australians were born in China. And they are feeling this period of Australia-China tensions much more acutely and in different ways than other Australians. And an example of this is this time last year, an Australian Senator, Erica Betts, questioned Chinese Australians during a Senate hearing, asking about their allegiance to Australia, which is not something that our other Australians of non-Chinese heritage were asked. So these tensions are really playing out in the business community, in the community of foreign-born Australians. And I think it's poisoning a lot of Australia's debate. It's also a problem for the university sector in terms of foreign students. You know, if China decides that its students aren't going to come to Australia, well, the whole education sector receives a major hit. So they are having a real impact. And comparing that with South Korea, I know from a Lowy poll that only 22% of South Koreans have a positive view of China. And in Australia, the same is happening. And when I say China, I mean the Chinese Communist Party, not Chinese citizens. So yes, in both Australia and South Korea, there is this decline in feeling towards the Chinese Communist Party. But again, this goes back to the point I made earlier, which is that China cares more, or China wants to be feared more than it wants to be loved. And that's a problem for its external relations. But how are we going to change that? We really have to think about new ways of engaging the Chinese Communist Party, and also recognizing different migrant communities in Australia and their real concerns, so that they feel more brought into this discussion and not forgotten.
Mm-hmm. We really need to think about how Australia and Korea can rebalance our relationship as middle powers. So the next question, both Jeffrey and Wongi, from Australian and Korean perspective. So Jeff, where does South Korea fit in Australia's diplomatic and strategic priorities? And Wongi, from Korean perspective, where does Australia fit in its geostrategic outlook?
Well, you've got to recognize that the idea that Korea is an important strategic and diplomatic partner is fairly recent in Australia. You know, you can go back 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and you look at Australia-Korea Forum reports, and academics were saying the same things 15 years ago that they are saying this year as reports come out. They've been arguing that the relationship should be improved all this time. So the Australian government is actually, it has to play catch up. It really has to catch up on the relationship. Now, the problem is that because they're so far behind, the relationship is basically starting from an empty seat. So I imagine that Professor Choe was quite surprised when he was asked to be the first Asia Society Australia-Korea Policy Fellow, because, you know, he normally covers ASEAN and India. And, you know, I guess his expertise finished at the Timor Sea and the Indian Ocean. It just didn't cover Australia. And if you look at any other situation, whether it's if you go to the KNDA website, or you go to the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security website, there's no publications on Australia. If you go to a library in Seoul, you maybe find a few publications on Australia, usually about mines or beaches. If you go to a university in Seoul, you don't find any courses on Australia. If you go to think tanks, you may find 1 or 2 publications up in the back in the archives. The result of all of this is that in policy circles in South Korea, Australia is irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant at the moment. But this is understandable. A good example of this would be Korean Peninsula affairs. So in Korean Peninsula affairs, it's always considered that South Korea's interaction with parties is bilateral. It's always between South Korea, North Korea, between South Korea, China, South Korea, the United States. It's totally unimaginable that a middle power, such as Australia, could actually play a role. And I think in the policy memo, Professor Choe actually says that Australia doesn't have the diplomatic resources, Australia doesn't play a role in the Korean Peninsula. That's understandable. But to tell the truth, if I was a South Korean diplomat, and if I were being sent to Beijing or Washington, and I was asked to argue for an end of war declaration, I would not want to be standing there negotiating with China or the United States and their diplomats as a middle power, sole, single middle power, because your negotiating leverage is just not there. Now, if I was that same diplomat, I would be going around other places first, maybe getting the support of Sweden, Norway, Canada, and Australia, and maybe NGOs and policy communities as well, and then going to Washington and Beijing. And that's what middle powers do. See, that is coalition building. That is innovative diplomacy. That is middle power diplomacy. But I think it's totally understandable that Australia currently is irrelevant in South Korean policy circles, and that's the job that Australia has to catch up on.
Well, I understand where Jeffrey's kind of depiction of Korea's lack of attention on Australia comes from, but I think I mean, you have to understand that. But I think you know already that the Korea's foremost priority is given to the inter-Korean relationship, and the majority of the diplomatic priorities and the resources and everything is devoted to this. So in that regard, we just focus on the major powers, right? China, US, Japan, and to a certain extent Russia, and the rest of the countries to this second tier group, right? So in Australia, I think, yeah, there is a certain element of truth in your point that we don't have really serious, genuine interest in forging a strategic partnership, Australia so far. I mean, Australia, we don't have anything in dispute. We don't have any conflicting interests with Australia. We share a lot of things, values, democracy, market, and all things, but that's it. So we are just like-minded, and that's it, right? So, but I think we need to go beyond that, right? We have to kind of realize that there are more than that between us, right? So since Australia began its Indo-Pacific kind of outlook at things like that, I think Australia's attention to Korea got more kind of invigorated. I mean, so far, I mean, it is true that Korea has not been afforded a kind of enough attention. I mean, in Australia, geostrategic outlook, the Five Eyes countries, the Quad, and now AUKUS, and Indonesia, the neighboring country. These are the priority partners, right? Korea is a little bit far away, right? Fell behind, right? But I think these days, the Australians, the strategic community pay more attention to Korea. And Hayley, you in your paper talk about, you made a very strong case about the defense cooperation between Australia and Korea, right? I do agree with this. So I think we do have a lot of kind of potential here. So important thing is that we have to overcome the inconsistency in our kind of attention to each other. And also we have some divergences in our priorities. So I think we have to kind of coordinate our priorities and need to make more diplomatic effort to have a deeper kind of strategic kind of understanding each other. So I think that's very important. So in that regard, I think this year is the 60th anniversary of diplomatic ties, and I hope that President Moon pay visit to Canberra to really celebrate the upgrading of the relationship.
You both mentioned that both countries are already far behind, and here we are facing the crisis and trying to restructure, rebuild relationships all around. And which we had a crystal ball. Who knew something like COVID would hit, and who knew about this China-US relations? But then the Biden-Xi summit last week, they made no apparent progress on trade issues, but they struck a hopeful note about the potential for future deals that can be mutually beneficial. Still, many of us cannot shake the feeling that China has been showing the Cold War behavior. So I have two questions for all of you before we take questions from the audience. First question is, do you think that the trade disputes will be resolved eventually, or do you think that things can get worse between China and the United States? And question two, what do you think is the most urgent task for both Australia and Korea in order to improve the bilateral relationship? So first question, if any of you want to answer with your crystal ball, do you think things will get better or worse?
Well, I can jump in on the second question. What should Australia do and what should Korea do? Well, Australia needs to start building a cohort of policy specialists and policy professionals in South Korea that actually see Australia as relevant. So that could include things such as, well, the Asia Society Australia-Korea Policy Fellow. That's a good start. but other things such as building and supporting Australian studies in South Korea, maybe even establishing an Australian institute. There's a Goethe Institute, an Académie Française, there's an ASEAN Centre. Why not an Australia Institute? Or something more innovative like a MICTA, Global Governance Institute, or something like this. But Australia needs to make itself relevant.
Hayley, would you like to jump in?
Thank you. Yes, I'm eager to tackle this second question, because I think the first question on could things get worse between the US and China is a unhappy discussion, because I think things can always get worse. And I'd prefer to focus on what Australia and South Korea can do, because too much of the discussion is about China or about the United States and not about our bilateral relationship. And I do agree with Jeffrey about more Australian studies in Korea. How we could make that attractive, though, I'd be very interested to find out, because for me, on the opposite of that, the Korean Peninsula is endlessly fascinating, whereas I don't find Australia very fascinating in comparison. And I mean, Jeffrey mentioned MICTA, which is the Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, Australia multilateral. I'm actually doing some research on minilats and multilats at the moment, after things like the AUKUS announcement and the Quad, neither of which include South Korea. And I think the best thing that we could do now to sort of re-energize the relationship is some sort of minilateral arrangement that involves Australia and South Korea. I've written that there could be an Australia, South Korea, India trilateral for the Black Swan strategy paper. And the reason I think that that could work is because in the past, when South Korea has shown it wants to do more on security and defense, including with the THAAD, it's been punished. That was a unilateral decision of South Korea on the THAAD. But when countries work multilaterally or minilaterally, China finds it much more difficult to criticize the whole cooperation, or not criticize, but actually inflict penalty. So while they might say that China will say that the Quad is a negative thing for regional security, it doesn't do anything in retaliation specifically to that announcement. So I feel as though working with other small groups, South Korea might have more flexibility to pursue its interests outside of Northeast Asia and more broadly in the region. So I would really like to see some sort of imagination in, if Australia and South Korea bilaterally have sort of stagnated in their relationship, what can they do with other partners in the region, considering South Korea is not included in things like AUKUS and the Quad? And because India is a major focus of South Korea's new Southern policy, I feel that India is a good fit for a trilateral. And I think, Yvonne, you also mentioned the potential for President Moon to visit Australia. I think that would be a significant development if we could have finally a presidential visit to Australia. That will do a lot to boost the relationship.
Mm-hmm. So, Wongi, would you like to stay on the bright side or the dark side? We actually have a question from the audience regarding President Moon's visit. So we could go right on to that. But if you want to comment on anything on the dark side, we're more than welcome to.
Well, I think we don't have any dark side, but I mean, we only have downside, and we have a lot of bright side down the road. I think if you look at the documents that came out of the 2+2 dialogue last September, the defense and foreign ministers dialogue, I mean, the document kind of describes a lot of potential areas that the two countries can work together from the economic cooperation, the hydrogen kind of new energy cooperation, also lots of kind of the defense cooperation potentials and things like that. And also what is most important at the government level, I think we need to have a closer consultation and deeper kind of exchange of strategic understandings and things like that. So and also so that we can kind of coordinate our priorities. I think that's most important. And also, I think if we have the summit level meeting within this year, that would be also a good catalyst to move the bilateral relationship forward.
And speaking of, we're now moving on to the audience questions. My counterpart in Australia, we are staying on the bright side now. Philip Ivanov asked, Australian media is reporting today that the Korean President Moon Jae-in is indeed visiting Australia next month. So what do our panelists think about his agenda and Australia's objectives for his visit? Wongi, would you like to go first?
Yeah. When we, I think that's very good news. So yeah, definitely that he should visit Australia. I think when we have some meeting, I think people working in the government, they have to work very hard to come up with some sort of joint documents and things like that. So I think they are kind of sorting out what sort of new things that we can do together. So so in that regard, I think if you look at the brief encounter between President Moon and Prime Minister Morrison on the sidelines of the new UN Assembly last September, they briefly talked about some of the areas, new areas, and some of the areas that we need to kind of reinforce our kind of collaboration. So lay out a lot of issue areas. So from hydrogen cooperation to defense industry cooperation to other kind of collaboration at the regional and global kind of forum. I think we have a lot of issues to work on.
And Hayley, the next question is for you from a foreign correspondent in Korea, Andrew Salmon. Traditionally, Australia has had a forward defense expeditionary approach to security. ROK has since Vietnam being the opposite. So realistically, can the circle ever be squared? Seems a major gap between the two.
Well, that's a great question. I love any question that goes to defense issues. I had never actually thought about that angle, but I don't think that the differences in their forward defense posture should limit any of their defense cooperation. In fact, if we're talking and reflecting on the potential for President Moon to visit, one of the major priorities, I think, should be about defense, because if Australia and South Korea are going to have a comprehensive strategic partnership, what does comprehensive mean? Well, to me, it means a really well-rounded relationship that's not just people to people, not just economic, not just political, but also defense. I think that people to people and an economic is very strong. A visit by President Moon will contribute to the political closeness. But on the defense side, I think what is needed between the two countries is a status of forces agreement, which is something that Australia has been negotiating with Japan for more than 7 years now. However, while Australia has indicated a huge preference to have the same kind of arrangement with South Korea, which would greatly benefit South Korea in terms of allowing Australia to assist South Korea more fully in any kind of contingency on the Korean Peninsula or elsewhere, South Korea hasn't been as receptive to the idea of starting along this long process. Maybe they're keeping an eye on the Australia-Japan status of forces agreement. But yeah, I wouldn't reflect on the differences in our defense postures. I would say there's so much to be gained from working more closely together. It just requires Australia to elevate South Korea consistently in all of our strategic documents. And it requires South Korea to be willing to work with Australia without having a foundation of strong defense material capability acquisition, which I know has been a thorn in the side of the relationship, where South Korea has very strong defense relations with countries that have purchased South Korean defense equipment, like Indonesia or the United Arab Emirates. But because Australia hasn't yet committed to a major acquisition, it's been a sort of stagnant relationship. So I'd like to see some progress in a number of areas there.
Yes, Jeffrey.
Yeah, I agree with what Hayley said and agree with what Professor Choe said. But I think we've got to remember that the visit to Australia of President Moon is coming at the end of his tenure. It's essentially a lame duck visit. So all that can be achieved is ceremonial, celebrating 60-year anniversary of diplomatic relations, perhaps sign a few documents on the comprehensive strategic agreement. But, you know, I mean, beggars can't be choosers. And it's a good thing to start off with. But perhaps in the future, Australia should send a prime minister to Korea early in the administration and hopefully get a visit back and, you know, build up the relationship from there.
And Wongi, you wanted to ask something?
I think both Korea and Australia does have homework to do. As Jeffrey just pointed out, President Moon is soon going out. I mean, in the coming March, we have presidential election, and the next government will take power in the coming next May next year. So yeah, even if President Moon made lots of commitment and promises, the next his successor will take the responsibility of implementing those things. Under President Moon's presidency, the regional initiative, our regional initiative, do certain policy does not cover Australia. So I think the next government should include Australia within the regional outlook of our kind of country. And also to Koreans, we wonder what sort of strategic value does Korea have to Australia? I mean, if what Australia is doing diplomatically and strategically in Northeast Asia, Japan is also always the number 1 priority partner. So I think when President Moon visit Canberra, I think you should ensure that what sort of a kind of values you find in the friendship with us. I mean, so that we can make what kind of relationship in the future. So in that regard, I think there should be some sort of kind of reassurance on the part of the Australians that make Korea kind of more proactive in collaborating with Australia down the road.
Hayley.
Yeah, thanks, Yvonne. I just wanted to come in very quickly about the point that Jeff raised about President Moon being in his lame duck period. It's such a negative way of looking at this. Could I just put a counter argument, which is that, you know, look at the Quad Summit, the historic in-person Quad Summit. Prime Minister Suga from Japan could be arguably, you know, in his lame duck period, only a few months away from losing the prime ministership. But the Quad meeting in DC was an incredible achievement. And I don't think having Prime Minister Suga undermined it in any way. And I just don't think a visit by a South Korean president should be delayed for any reason, because if you also had to wait for the next administration after March next year, it would be very difficult for a South Korean president to make their inaugural overseas visit to Australia. I think that would, I mean, it'd be a wonderful thing, but I think it's also unlikely. So I wouldn't discount, you know, the importance of a visit like this.
And comment from you, Jeff, too?
Yeah, Hayley's totally correct. I wouldn't discount it, and that is important. But there's, you know, really big differences between continuity in Japanese politics and continuity in South Korean presidential administrations. Now, you know, like I said, beggars can't be choosers, so it is important. But I really think that we've got to build that up so that there is more, I guess, acceptance of the idea that these two states are ideal diplomatic partners, not necessarily strategic partners. That can come later. So thinking about Australia playing a role in North Asia or South Korea playing a role around our region, no, that's wrong. But they are ideal diplomatic partners working together in global governance, working together in regional issues. That's where the real key for the two states lies.
Mm-hmm. And I think I'm just going to pick a really short question, because short but big question. And since we don't have enough time left, what role might greater economic integration between Korea and Australia play? How might this best be achieved? For example, through enhancements to Korea-Australia FTA, or Korea potentially joining the CPTPP?
Well, I think the economic cooperation is very important. Currently, Korea is bidding to join CPTPP, and Australia is one of the key members of CPTPP. So, well, you have CPTPP is for Korea, it's just a backdoor bilateral FTA with Japan. So because the relationship between Korea and Japan is very kind of at low point, I don't think Japan would be really proactive about Korea joining CPTPP. And in that regard, I think there is some work that Australia can do for us.
Jeff?
Trade agreements are very important, but again, I think that's getting ahead of ourselves, because Australia-Korea trade has been very successful in the past based upon their shared complementarity. But do you know that if you're an Australian business person in South Korea, there's no bank where you can have dual bank accounts between Australia and Korea? If you're an Australian business person in South Korea, it's difficult to get your children into schools. If you're an Australian business person in South Korea, it's extremely difficult to send money back to Australia. There's lots of little issues which restrict Australians coming to Korea and opening businesses, and Koreans coming to Australia to open businesses. So, you know, we've got to take the baby steps first before we start thinking about these very large trade agreements, because these very large trade agreements, that's great for the chaebol and great for the big multinationals in Australia, but it's not good for person-to-person relations and small business.
Unfortunately, we ran out of time, and so we must end here. But let's please leave with a happier note that now South Koreans and Japanese are able to travel to Australia, really starting December 1st. So thank you for that, and let's just keep our fingers crossed and hope that other things will also improve in terms of our bilateral relationship. And thank you. I would like to, again, thank the Australia-Korea Foundation for supporting this project. Many thanks to Wongi, Jeff, and Hayley for taking the time to participate in this important conversation. Thanks also to all of you in the audience around the world for joining our program today. Your support is what makes our organization truly global. And lastly, and most importantly, I'd like to express my sincere appreciation to my colleagues at Asia Society Australia, Philip and Lena and Lois, for giving me and the Korea Center the opportunity to participate in this important discussion. Please make sure to visit our websites to learn more about our upcoming events. Our next public program will be, my screen just disappeared, excuse me. Will be on Tuesday, 30th November on the gender paradox of STEM, considering the current global tech race where nations compete for investment, knowledge, and innovation. Technological skills are both a competitive advantage and a strong geopolitical asset. This event will look at why women continue to be underrepresented in tech sectors and how countries are at the cutting edge of technology, like Korea, can benefit from an enhanced female workforce. You can register now using the link we are sharing with you or by scanning our QR code. We hope to see you there. In the meantime, please continue to stay safe. Thank you again, and hope you all have a lovely afternoon.